Hi, I'm Naomi Murphy, and this is the Locked Up Living podcast, where we talk with a wide range of people about harsh aspects of institutional life.
We also explore some of the ways to overcome them and to grow and develop. I'm David Jones. So join us every Wednesday morning, 6 o'clock UK time, for a fresh podcast.
Hi Philip, really good to see you again. So Philip, like many of our guests, you're not unfamiliar to forensic work, are you? What did you do before you trained as a psychotherapist?
Well, when I left school, rather peremptorily, I spent 2 years as a hippie and an actor in Plymouth. And then at the point at which people were telling me that I ought to train as an actor, I did what became accustomed really to, which is to run away from it. I thought, there's no way I can make a living. There are so many very good actors and they can't make livings. So I had always been really interested in psychoanalysis since I was 11 and first read the only book that an 11-year-old could read of Freud's, which was The Psychopathology of Everyday Life, to try to help me understand the awfulness of what I was experiencing in my life. So I wanted to go back to that. So I tried to improve my A levels while working as an assistant nurse in children and adolescent psychiatric unit in Exeter. Then I did my psychology degree, and then I saw an advert for a job as a group worker at something that was new, brand new idea, called a youth treatment centre, which was for children and adolescents who had committed very, very serious crimes. And it had been invented by probably the last time that the Social Service Inspectorate were able to think creatively and not follow a kind of groupthink state of mind. And they thought that there may be quite a significant group of such kids who could benefit from some sort of treatment, and that they should provide that. And so they found a place which had been built essentially to be an improved school. So they used that as the site for the youth treatment centre, and they suggested that it might be that the best way to work to provide treatment for these young people would be informed by psychoanalysis, therapeutic communities, and similar kinds of enterprises and theories. And that beyond that, they had nothing much more that they could offer except have a go and see what you can do, which was rather wonderful. The first attempt to do it was led by a psychiatrist and collapsed. And when I applied, was joining the second attempt to make this work. And I was given a job, which was extraordinary because the group work level of the job was senior people in their own professions, and the professions that people came from were teaching, nursing, and residential social work. And I had no work experience. I'd done stuff while I was at university, because university was thoroughly irritating, and done any kind of, hadn't got a professional qualification. So I was accepted into this group and joined in the enterprise of trying to discover how we might make a difference. And then a couple of years into my time there, just as I was missing the hippie thing and preparing to go off to India and do that, a job as they called them house leaders of one of the units came up, and the consultant psychiatrist told me that I should apply, which I thought was quite mad. So I applied and demonstrated that it was quite mad because I was appointed. And that was the beginning of a number of extraordinary experiences, not least of which was a period of about 18 months of feeling absolutely terrible, feeling constantly a failure, constantly frightened. I mean, I literally used to shake as I was driving to work, and all the time feeling if something went wrong, if the kids acted out in some kind of way, that it was my fault. And then the same psychiatrist suggested that I might be interested in doing the training at the Tavistock Clinic in consulting to organizations. And so I thought anything, I'd do anything to get out of this awful feeling. And I got onto that course. And the first thing that happened was that we were sharing our work experience. And I told them what a complete failure I was, really, and how bad I was at the work and how frightened I was about what I was doing and how dreadful I felt about all the mistakes I was making. And they said, Phil, you do understand, don't you, that these feelings have been projected into you from the kids via the staff. And I can't tell you what a absolutely wonderful road to Damascus kind of experience that was when I suddenly could see how true it was. And it changed my life completely. And it led to my first understanding about the work, which is that we work at our best by experiencing, absorbing feelings projected into us unconsciously by our clients or patients or whatever you might call them. And the work happens when we can transform that raw feeling into information about the patients. And suddenly that makes the work absolutely fascinating. And it means that you can start to really engage and to make a real connection with, in this case, the young people. That's a rather long answer to your question.
Can I ask you where this was? Where was the youth centre that you're describing?
It was called a youth treatment centre, and it was in Brentwood, Essex, and it was called St. Charles Youth Treatment Centre.
And it was led by psychiatrists at that time?
No, the first one was the psychiatrist-led one, which was the failure, which, we may, if you want, pursue that and why that is so obviously likely to happen. The next leader was a chap called Trev Edwards, who came from the residential care sector. And in my mind, and I speak as somebody now, as you can see, of an enormously advanced age, so from experience of working with organizations over a long, long time, he remains, in my view, the best manager I've ever worked with. He knew very little about psychoanalytic work or group work or anything like that. But he trusted that he had managed to appoint people who really did. And he saw his job as to protect us from the invasive questioning of the government. We were run directly by the government. We were initially by the Home Office and then by the Department of Health and Social Security. And so his job was to protect us so that we could do what the Social Service Inspectorate had asked us to do, which is to find out how to do this job. And we did gradually. And it was at times very, very challenging and very difficult. But we did discover some very key things that worked. And I kind of turned out to be the person who was able to conceptualize all of this. And so it was felt that I brought it all together and created the idea of how to make it work.
And I'm reminded as you're talking, Philip, how similar the start of that project sounds to the start of the Dangerous and Severe Personality Disorder project, which was, I was the treatment lead for the first of those services, but again, kind of like set up by the Minister of Justice and answerable to them to start off with, and different there's something nice about the freedom to do something different because there's a recognition that what is already happening isn't working, but how easy it could be for that to go wrong, as well as actually there's the opportunity to get something right. And you did mention the fact that there'd been this first one that hadn't gone right, and I wondered if you had thoughts about what hadn't gone right.
I wasn't there for the first one, so I don't know exactly, but I think that why it went wrong was because there was a premature move towards diagnosis and towards allocating a kind of identity to the young people rather than encountering them where they were. And that's because they were, of course, exactly what it said on the tin, dangerous. And so I think that the people at the top felt that the first thing to do was to try and contain the danger, which I think is an understandable thing, but I also think is a mistake, because you then treat the individual according to his or her behavior, which entirely misses the real individual inside and the way that you can make a difference And actually, we did make a huge difference, because there was a very high level of violent incidents at the beginning of my time at the youth treatment center. And by the time we felt that we really knew what we were doing, there was very, very little violence. And I can explain something of that if you're interested about why that happened.
Absolutely. I mean, again, it's resonating because the project that I went to had been open for 3 years by the time I went there. So many of the resources had gone into assessment of risk, assessment of danger, labelling people as psychopaths and giving them a diagnosis. And actually very little attention had been given to thinking about what needed to happen to them afterwards. And again, you have a problematic, the unit was set up for the most dangerous men in the English prison system. But actually, by shifting the focus onto how to make people feel safe through treatment, led to very different results. And we had very, very low levels of violence in the unit that I led compared to the rest of the prison, for instance. It was the unit of despite having this population, but including men who had killed whilst in prison, committed very serious offences, but actually had the lowest levels of violence at Whitemoor Prison. So yeah, I am really interested in what you learned there in your reflections, and I wondered about what it taught you about the needs of young people who offend.
Well, okay. First, to start where you're starting from, which is that question, it is a general truth, I think, about children and adolescents. So this is about all of them, not those who offend. That it's a terrible error that parents often make, to give too much decision making to the child. They're not equipped to make decisions for a number of different reasons, but the most obvious one, which I often, when I'm trying to teach people about this, talk about the decision about what secondary school kids should go to. And I think it's a terrible thing to give that choice to the 11-year-old or however old it might be, because then the 11-year-old, when it all feels as if it's gone wrong, is left blamed for it. But the 11-year-old has no way of knowing how to make a decision about what's a good school, for two reasons. One is that they have no sense of time in the way that an adult does. They've only been around 11 years, of which about 5 are as much as they can remember. So they can't imagine forward, let alone be able to understand anything about the things that they don't know, which they're going to learn when they're at school. And so there is a question about decision making that comes very early on, and particularly with kids who end up being very violent and destructive, that they are left, it seems to me, and for lots and lots of different stories, everybody has their own unique story, but they are left with decision making about how to spend their time and how to use their time in ways that are always too demanding for them. And then what they do is that they look for places where they can feel safe. And in the absence of a safe place at home, they very often find a safe place in a gang. And that then reinforces a particular kind of behavior, which is violence and the expression of getting rid of your anxiety by making somebody else feel anxious, by becoming violent towards them. So the first thing is to be able to make them feel safe, in the sense not that they're kind of physically locked up, because that doesn't make you feel safe. I think that can make you feel very, very scared, actually. Instead, make them feel safe by showing that we are not going to invite them to make decisions that are going to be asking too much of them. And that this will come about because the adults are really interested in what's going on in that young person. So the main mechanism that allows for a decrease in anxiety and therefore the beginning of being able to feel safe, which is the word we're looking for really, is the experience that I am cared about. And so the means by which that's delivered is what I like to call a benign inquiry. That staff who feel able to conduct a benign inquiry into what's going on here, which is simply another way of describing a loving curiosity about what's going on here, make the children feel two things. One is that they're contained because there is an intervention going on, which is saying, hang on, let's think about what's going on here. But the other thing is that they feel that somebody cares, and that provides this sense of safety.
It's very interesting what you're talking about. Now, if you want to see a really perfect example of what you're describing, then just watch the film The Quiet Girl, which was on Channel 4 the other night, but you can get it on catch up. And it's a story set in Ireland about a little girl who's, I think, the third or fourth child of a dysfunctional family who goes to stay with her sort of aunt and uncle, who look after her, who see that she's there. It's a beautiful example of what you're talking about.
Good, thank you. I will do that.
So, Philip, what did you learn about yourself from the work? What stayed with you after you left?
Oh, all kinds of things. I mean, just to go back to what I said about how awful it was to be put in the position of being a leader. And I was, at that time, and for many years, I was the youngest person on site other than the kids. And yet I was in this very senior position. So the first thing I learned about myself is how vulnerable I am to feelings of failure, aloneness, isolation, and so on. What I also learned was that in the process of recognizing that these things, on the one hand, do belong to me, they are my personality, although I think these days things have changed and I've got other weird features of my personality. But although it's truly me, they also operate as hooks. Wilfred Bion called them valencies, that we all have that are easily perceived unconsciously and so get, as it were, activated by somebody else unconsciously. And therefore, if you can face these things in yourself, then when they're activated at work, you can actually find that knowing that this is to do with the work makes them very, very sensitive receptors for feelings that particular kids are having and getting rid of into you and into other members of staff. So I learned that my own personality idiosyncrasies, when properly attended to, also became very helpful in the work and enabled me to transform feelings that couldn't be managed by kids and then subsequently patients and so on, to transform them into meaningful information.
You're highlighting something really important there, aren't you, as well, though, I think in terms of, I think there is a kind of like defensiveness, laziness, maybe, at times that in staff groups it's easy to see it all as being about what the patient is generating in the team rather than thinking about what we might bring and what we might have the power to do something about to make ourselves be a little bit more protected rather than leave ourselves vulnerable to acting things out because something has resonated for us.
Well, yeah, I mean, so I think that's so important, actually, what you just said, because from that time, for the rest of my professional life up till this very minute, I have always built mechanisms in the teams that I'm managing that provide a space to be able to think about the feelings that are happening at work, and a space where people are not going to be therapized or something, where instead those feelings are going to be available to be understood. And without that, then people end up reinforcing their own defensive strategies around what are vulnerabilities in themselves, in their own personality. They end up reinforcing the defensive strategies, which is why in many residential kind of institutions, including prisons, young offender institutions and so on, why people become very fixed in their behavior. It's a kind of fear of being open, and it results in burnout, and it can be very damaging to individuals. But where there is a benign, again, the same word, a benign inquiry, two words actually, a benign inquiry going on, and that we know that this is not about turning us into patients. It is about the complexity of the interaction between us and our clients. When that's happening, then people are able to leave work at work and go off and have enjoyable lives, and therefore their time at work is much more fruitful and enjoyable, actually.
So it sounds like a very rich working experience whilst you were there, Philip. Why did you end up leaving?
Because of Margaret Thatcher, which is, she arrived. We were run, as I said, by at that stage, we were at the Department of Health and Social Security, and the permanent undersecretary there was a very nice chap who, sadly and embarrassingly, but that's because I'm so old, I can't remember his name, but he was a really nice guy and was very supportive of me. And he showed me a Xerox. I don't suppose any of you know what a Xerox was, but it was the original form of duplication that was always smudged, and God knows however it got used. But a Xerox copy of a message that had been sent around by the Cabinet Secretary to all permanent secretaries of all the departments, saying she will not tolerate any of us telling her that, giving her advice that come from so-called experts. And he said, "Be careful, Philip, that's the writing on the wall." And I noted that. And then a few years later, it was very clear that there was tremendous pressure to reduce the quality of staffing in our youth treatment centre. And they opened another one in Birmingham, which was based entirely on behaviourist lines, run by a chap called Masood Hagougi, who had been running ACLIF in Durham, entirely on behaviourist lines. And his view really was that you just have to write the programme, and staff and kids, all of them, just fit into the programme. They don't have to have a mind, they don't have to think, they just do what they're told. And this was awful to witness. And I could sense that there was this move, kind of pincer movement around St. Charles to try to get rid of expert. And when Trev Edwards left, his successor was appointed from that kind of background. And I thought, this is no good will come of this. And then when they refused to appoint somebody to a role, by then I was an assistant director, when they refused to appoint somebody to a role that I thought she was eminently suitable for, I thought, that's it, I've got to go. And I made this rather childish gesture of resigning and refusing to be there any longer, which was a silly thing to do. Didn't have a job. That's why I left. Mind you, I mean, it is interesting that 250 years later, I get approached by somebody who is setting up something called Secure Stairs in the YOI estate, because they recognized through actually the PD-CUF, personality disorder knowledge and understanding framework, which was based on a lot of my kind of meanderings. And they recognized that what they were trying to do had already been invented. And so they came to me. So I had a brief resurgence of forensic life with Cookham Wood, and that was good. And I enjoyed that intervention, which of course was undermined completely by the Department of Justice, as it would be.
Fascinating. I'm sure there's much more we could talk about there. And it's another thing we can add to the list of things to blame Margaret Thatcher for. From looking at your website, it seems as though you're very interested in how important ruptures are to the therapeutic relationship. Can you say a bit more about this?
Yes, I put it like this, that boundaries are where the work happens. So if I take as an example simply as the psychoanalytic encounter, so a patient and an analyst. If the patient is sitting there or lying there, kind of working through all the stuff that he's been thinking about in a way that seems appropriate to understanding himself more and more, the analyst has nothing to do. You can make his shopping list or prepare his food or something like that. The reason why you come to life is because you discover that the patient is treating you in a way that has broken the boundary. Now, what I mean by a boundary, there's the therapeutic boundary, is very clear, which is you are a patient, you can say or do anything you want, and I am a psychotherapist or psychoanalyst, and my job is to try to understand the unconscious meaning behind what you just said or done. That's a simple kind of arrangement, and I think it works from the moment that it's set up. And then when the patient treats you quite clearly as somebody who is making an aggressive and nasty judgment, they've broken the boundary because they're not treating you like a psychoanalyst. And so then you have to wake up and start to think, what's going on here? And you try to reestablish the boundary by doing two things. One is to describe in a simple way that a boundary's been broken. You say, you seem to feel that I am a judging, nasty, horrible person. But you also stick to your side of it, which is to then think about, well, what might have made that happen? And you wait until a thought comes to you. It might be something like, which is very much like you were describing your father last time we met. And then lo and behold, what you've done, other psychoanalysts would call, you've made an interpretation. And so for me, that's the work. The work always happens at the boundary. We are always pulled across the boundary. There is a phenomenon in psychoanalysis that is very well known called countertransference, and a linked phenomenon called projective identification. But you will know that transference is when the patient perceives the therapist as a figure from their past. And the countertransference is that the therapist feels like that. And of course, as soon as you feel like that, you're already being pulled across the boundary. If you don't notice that this is happening to you and you start behaving like that, then you have moved across the boundary. And at that point, what really matters is not that you've broken a boundary, because I'm saying that that's where the work happens. So you're always going to break a boundary if you're doing work well and in the right area. The important thing is to notice it and then to understand it and to use that understanding to share something with the patient about what's just happened. So for me, this idea, which I first started thinking about in the youth treatment center, because it was happening all the time there, has been a central feature of my thinking and my teaching, and more recently my writing, because it has an impact on how you think about the work. If you know that the boundary will always be broken, then the two things follow from that. One, which is about therapy, is that if you can imagine that that's the sort of boundary to the therapeutic container, eventually, if that's going on enough, it'll break. And so if that's going to happen, then it's sensible to have already provided a secondary container which will hold on to the work. And examples of a secondary container begin with the therapist using their own mind and the capacity to move in your mind to a third position and look at you and patient together, and then see what's going on that you might not have seen if you hadn't had that capacity. So that's the secondary container within the therapist. And then there is a secondary container that is provided, and I think is absolutely essential and links to what I said about always having available people to help you to think about your work, which is more or less summarized by the word supervisor. That you have somebody who you can turn to describe your work, who is able to pick up the things that you're not noticing about how you're getting caught up in the work and how you're being drawn across the boundary. Now, the second,
I was just going to ask you, Philip, is that an argument for having on-site supervisors? You know, there can be a bit of a trend to have supervisors external to a service, but of course, and I can see there are merits to that, but also in terms of understanding what the dynamics might be about the patient, a unit, the staff member, knowledge of all of those components can make a massive difference to what gets people bring to supervision, what they're conscious of, don't they? Not the stuff that they're unconscious of.
Very, I may come across as a benign and pleasant individual, but there are things that I feel very firmly about. And one of them is that it may be that for reasons very often of resources, that supervisors are recruited from outside an institution. But that cannot work unless they are, by contract, part of the secondary container, which you can do very easily with a contract and with a requirement that the supervisors meet with somebody who supervises the supervisors on a regular kind of basis and that sort of thing. It's not a difficult thing to set up. But it's absolutely right that you need that, because the purpose, when you look at it in the way that I'm describing, the purpose of the supervision is based upon this principle that the work happens at the boundary, and therefore that supervision protects both the patient and the therapist from staying the wrong side of the boundary. And that absolutely is the responsibility of the institution that provides the boundary. And therefore, the secondary container has to be part of the institution. It is part of the institutional role. And so you can imagine that the supervisors are kind of located in the walls of the container.
Thank you. Well, that's a very, very clear description of that major part of therapeutic process. Thanks very much indeed for that. So another subject that you've been interested in is the hierarchy of decision making. Can you tell us a bit about your thoughts on this?
How long have you got? So this comes from my work as an organizational consultant, but it begins again at St. Charles. It's weird. I mean, now that I'm kind of conscious of the ending of my life, I'm looking back and seeing the website that you're referring, at least I hope the one you're referring to is the one that I've recently started, which is, there you are. That it's there to capture something of the development of my thinking and of my ideas and my interventions. And what is interesting to me is how many things that I thought I had developed much later in my career were already, as it were, foreshadowed at the Youth Treatment Centre, but not necessarily conceptualized in the way that I conceptualize them now. And the healthy organization model, which is what you're referring to, which has been generously received by a lot of people, is based on looking at how one might describe. By the way, it's a myth. There is no such thing as a healthy organization. So it's a myth in the same way that a really healthy human being is a myth. But it's very helpful in locating where things are going wrong. And it also helps because it provides an attitude to discovering things going wrong, which is not blaming, but being curious about it. So that's the background to the way one thinks about it. But the hierarchy of decision-making is something that occurs when an organization can no longer be described as an entrepreneurial system. Most startups, and indeed psychoanalysis in Vienna, began as an entrepreneurial system. And what I mean, the specific thing about the entrepreneurial system is that there is a leader, sometimes two leaders or more, but everybody doing work is connected directly to that leader. And that's a nice little happy family thing. But when it gets too big, you have to reorganize it so that there are systems that replace the direct connection with the leader. And those systems are systems essentially of delegation of decision making. And the line management system is, when it's healthy, it is entirely built around the delegation to the lowest sensible level of decision making. So you are authorized to make decisions by the person above you, who's been authorized to do that by the person above them, and so on, in exchange for which you are obliged to give an account of how you're working, because that's the reflection in an organization of this same thing that we were talking about earlier on, that you are bound to be affected by the work. So in the process of addressing your task, you will be made anxious. Just in parenthesis, my view about anxiety is essentially anxiety is merely a feeling that has not yet been named. That's all. And sometimes a feeling that you're not even aware of, but you're affected by. And in the moment of account about the work to your superior in the line management system, as long as they are approaching this account with a benign inquiry, then it becomes possible to inquire into what's going on, as it were, at a deeper level. So, the nurse who has had a really difficult day in A&E, which is how it is these days, then accounts to the nurse manager and says, well, yeah, we got through, but. And the nurse manager, if they're sensitive, they say, well, hang on, wait a minute, you're telling me more than this. It feels like it's been awful. And then nurse says, it's been absolutely impossible, just not enough of us. And so suddenly the feeling is transformed into information because of the encounter with a benign inquiry. And then that information can get passed on upstairs along with the anxiety that will then be unconscious in the manager about the way that he's going to or she's going to be received by people who don't want to provide any resources, and so on. And so that way, anxiety is passed up the line, and authority to do things, make decisions, is passed down the line. And that is the organizational equivalent of the circulation of the blood. That's the simplest description I can give of the hierarchy of decision making. I could go on about it forever, but you can build on that and things can come out of that.
Thank you. So before we move on to another area of your working life, I know you've been interested in how we develop the capacity to think. I think this may also be connected to the work of Beyond that you mentioned earlier. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Okay. The word that immediately comes to my mind is narrative. In a kind of standing outside, briefly, you can't really stand outside, but sort of outside our existence as a species, what we can say, I think, with some confidence, is that human beings are social animals who, not completely uniquely, but pretty well almost uniquely, are designed to look after the vulnerable members of society. Now, biologists have been telling us for years, and nobody listens, that there is a very good reason for this, which is that human infants are born prematurely. I think that's very obvious. I spent my secondary school years on Dartmoor, where there's very little else to do than watch lambs being born. And they don't sort of pop out and sit there thinking, well, what the hell do I do now? They very quickly get up onto their feet and they go off and look for a nipple. And not just any old nipple, their mummy's nipple. And babies don't do that. Human babies absolutely can't do that. And so that means that it is important for human beings that we are designed to want to look after the vulnerable. Now, when you think about that as the context, and you notice that quite a lot of people grow up and appear to find that a struggle to be looking after the vulnerable, it raises the question, well, since it's such a good design, and it is a good design, we're the most successful species on the planet, that's why we're destroying it. The question is obvious, which is, well, what happened to that process? And then when you start to look at the difference between, or other differences between ourselves and animals, you notice that Freud had a lot to say about this, which was really, really helpful. He said that babies, human babies, and all animals are driven to behave by feelings. And the feelings are so intense that the animal and baby are driven to behave, to act, to get rid of the feeling. It's a horrible experience. And he called that the pleasure principle, meaning that the arrival of a feeling, and that means, by the way, that all feelings are conscious. You know, you hear people claiming to be therapists saying, oh, that's an unconscious feeling. It can't be an unconscious feeling. It's a feeling, meaning you're feeling it, or you aren't feeling it, in which case that's very interesting. It's not, feelings are only conscious. But the intensity is the thing that makes animals act. but something happens to human beings. And Freud said that at a certain moment, human beings turn to face reality. But he didn't explain why. And I think Bion does. And I think Bion explains why by saying that in addition to the sort of component drives of love and hate, which are common to animals and to ourselves, human beings have as an innate drive. Doesn't mean that there aren't drives that develop subsequently in animals and so on, but as an innate drive, as an innate part of our nature, we have curiosity. And curiosity, I think, operates like a kind of, what would you say, a sort of software that requires us constantly to explain to ourselves what's happening to us. So from birth, well, from before birth, I think we're doing that. We're explaining to ourselves what's happening to us, but we can only do it from what we already know. And for the baby, that's very little. But the very first explanations for what's happening to us were described by the Kleinians as the primitive defenses. They didn't think like I do, just to bear that in mind. They were describing what they found in young children, and very accurately they described these primitive defenses, which are essential to our lives. Why are they essential? Because every single one of them, projection, denial, all of the simple defenses, create a space. Instead of hunger being here in me, hunger is happening as something out there to me. So it creates a space. So the baby's very first explanations do something that animals don't get to do, which is that there is a space between the experience and the source of the experience. Now, these things are all invented, of course, and eventually the baby discovers that there isn't a hunger monster kicking them in the stomach, but it gives them space. And then the next thing that the baby is able to do is to experience a yummy, yummy mummy who, when the baby, who, just like all the animals, can only act in the face of an intense feeling, so the action of a baby is that thing. When mummy can stay with that and bear it, she eventually processes it, discovers what it means, and transforms it into something that makes everybody feel better, including the baby. So the baby gets two things, space and a model for how to use that space. And that's the beginning of thinking. And when those things are present, then gradually thinking will develop, and it's thinking that is the alternative to action. And it's thinking that provides the opportunity then to face and look at reality. And so that's why I'm interested in the development of thinking and how it develops throughout life and how it goes very complex in adolescence, because we can ask questions then about if certain things are absent, we have some idea of when they would have developed if everything had been going, like in the model of the healthy organization, if everything had been going in a healthy way. And so we then are helped to be able to think, what is it that might be going on here for this particular patient? We've got a way of thinking about it to do with the past.
And I suppose that struggle that you're describing that the baby has is something that continues for us all throughout the rest of life.
Absolutely. And I think, when there's a danger about me kind of giving these answers in this rather succinct way, that it sounds like I'm simplifying and oversimplifying, and also it sounds like I'm being very certain. The thing about the encounter with another human being is that it begins with not knowing. And this is another thing that I'm very grateful to Bion for, because I spend most of my life not knowing. I have no idea what's going on for most of the time that I'm meeting somebody or I'm in a group with an organization or whatever it is. What I do know is that at some point, an idea will come to my mind, and it will come from my own unconscious. And then I'll be able to think, what does this mean, and apply it. And so in the process of being able to work with individual patients or with groups, this is always a balance between managing not knowing and not getting prematurely certain about something, but having the confidence that the benign inquiry, the looking at, the being genuinely interested, is going to enable something to take place. And more recently, in my later years, I felt that what this means is that love is a very important part of this work. And if you're not able to, in some way, love your patients, you really shouldn't be working.
Absolutely, I couldn't agree more. I think sometimes you hear therapists say, I don't have to like my patient to, and I think I couldn't disagree more. I think you have to at least be wanting to like the patient and wanting to overcome those barriers to liking them, else how on earth can you do something meaningful with them?
Absolutely. Yeah, I agree.
Wondered, Philip, how, you've been doing work really at times working with quite disturbed people and organisations, and I wonder how you've looked after your own well-being over the course of your career.
Well, I think I've kind of covered that in a way, because whatever I've done, when I was at the TAVI, as I was, I ran a team called, because the TAVI was filled with inspiring titles, the SCI. I wanted to call it, what makes the work so difficult, a psychoanalytic approach to understanding. And they said, oh, God, no, don't say things like that. Call it a short course intervention. So that's what it was called. But the short course intervention, it required us to demonstrate, and this was really consulting to a wide, huge range of organizations, it required us, I thought it was really important, to model what we were, as it were, teaching people. The most important part of what we were doing in trying to teach people something was to emphasize that it is not a failure to not notice. The failure is not to want to discover how one is being pulled into the other side of the boundary and so on. And so you provide, and I think it's a duty, quite frankly, of organizations that require people to do intimate work with other human beings. I think it's a duty to provide a space for people to talk about the experience. And in doing so, first of all, transform anxiety into meaningful data. But secondly, because it becomes meaningful data, to have that very nice experience of suddenly feeling enthusiastic again about the work. So I've carried that with me in everything I do. It was an essential part of the team. The team had to meet regularly to do that. And I've always looked for and maintained some kind of place to talk about my work, which has then enabled me to enjoy my life with my family and friends.
Terrific answer, Philip. Thank you. Fascinating conversation. Really enjoyed it. Thanks very much for coming on.
Well, thank you very much. I've enjoyed it too.
Thanks very much, Philip, and great to meet you.